Maria closed her eyes and pressed her palms together, her knees hitting the cold kitchen floor as Miguel's cries grew more desperate, and Sophia began to whimper beside her. "Please, God," she whispered through cracked lips, "I don't know what else to do." Her children needed food now. Not tomorrow, not after some miracle job appeared, but right now, while their small bodies shook with hunger and their eyes looked to her for answers she didn't have. The kitchen suddenly filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the broken heating system. And when Maria opened her eyes, a gentle light was spreading across the walls like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Sophia stopped crying and pointed behind her mother, her small mouth forming a perfect O of wonder. There, standing beside the empty cabinets with hands extended in blessing, was a woman in flowing blue robes whose face radiated such peace that Maria felt her panic dissolve into something approaching reverence. "My child," the woman spoke without moving her lips, her voice filling the space like music, "God sees your faithfulness to these little ones." She moved toward the cabinets that Maria had searched only moments before, and as her hands touched each door, they swung open to reveal shelves suddenly abundant with fresh bread, ripe fruit, vegetables still dewy from harvest, and milk so white it seemed to glow. Miguel stopped crying and clapped his tiny hands while Sophia ran to touch the miraculous feast that had appeared from nowhere. The woman turned back to Maria with eyes that held all the compassion in the world. "Teach them that their Father provides for his children," she said, and then the light faded as gently as it had come, leaving behind only the overwhelming scent of roses and enough food to feed them for weeks. Sophia burst through the apartment hallway, clutching a perfect apple, her excitement echoing off the narrow walls as she knocked on Mrs. Chen's door. "The lady in the pretty dress gave us food," she announced to the elderly woman who emerged in her house slippers, confusion creasing her weathered face. Lots and lots of food, and she smelled like flowers and made the kitchen all bright and warm like sunshine. Mrs. Chun followed Sophia back to apartment 2B, where Maria stood in her doorway, embarrassment flooding her cheeks as neighbors began to gather. The abundance spilling from her kitchen was impossible to ignore. Fresh loaves of bread lined the counters, fruit filled every available bowl, and vegetables crowded the small table where the eviction notice had been buried under miraculous provision. How could she explain what had happened when she barely understood it herself? Father Rodriguez arrived within the hour, summoned by Mrs. Chin's urgent phone call about strange happenings in the Santos apartment. The young priest had served this community for 3 years, ministering to families who survived on food stamps and government assistance, and he approached with the careful skepticism of someone who had heard desperate stories before. But Miguel ran to him with a perfect pair that had no earthly explanation, and Sophia began describing the beautiful lady with such innocent detail that his practiced doubt began to waver. The priest examined the food with hands that had blessed countless meals for the hungry, noting the freshness that defied the empty cabinets he had seen just yesterday during his pastoral visits. Other families from the complex crowded into the hallway, drawn by whispered conversations about miracles and impossible abundance, their own empty stomachs making them witnesses to something their minds struggled to accept. The cabinet door slammed shut with nothing but dust, and an empty jar echoing back at Maria Santos. Her 4-year-old daughter Sophia tugged at her worn pajama pants, asking why breakfast was taking so long, while 2-year-old Miguel sat on the linoleum floor banging a plastic spoon against his high chair tray. The eviction notice lay crumpled on the kitchen table next to her last $3.67, counted and recounted until the coins were warm from her desperate fingers. Maria opened the refrigerator knowing what she would find. Half a cup of milk, 2 eggs with questionable dates, and a wilted head of lettuce that had seen better days. Sophia pressed her small face against Maria's leg, her stomach making those hollow, rumbling sounds that cut through her mother's heart like glass. The apartment complex around them buzzed with the morning routines of other struggling families, single mothers, and elderly tenants who had learned to make miracles from nothing, but Maria's pride had always kept her from knocking on their doors. She knelt down to Sophia's eye level, brushing the dark hair from her daughter's forehead with hands that trembled from more than just hunger. The rent was due in 3 days, and Mrs. Patterson from the management office had made it clear that their patience had run out along with Maria's excuses. Miguel began to cry, the kind of frustrated wail that meant his little body was running on empty, and Sophia looked up at her mother with those trusting brown eyes that still believed Mama could fix everything. The morning light streaming through their thin curtains illuminated the kitchen that had once been filled with the aromas of her grandmother's recipes, back when hope seemed as abundant as the rice and beans that never seemed to run out. The knock on Maria's door came at 7 in the morning, sharp and official. 2 women in matching blazers stood in the hallway with clipboards and skeptical expressions, introducing themselves as Mrs. Wallace and Ms. Peterson from Child Protective Services. "We received reports about unusual circumstances in your home," Mrs. Wallace explained, her eyes scanning the apartment that still held traces of yesterday's impossible abundance. Maria's sister Carmen arrived during the interview, her nurse's uniform still crisp from the night shift. She pulled Maria aside in the kitchen while the social workers questioned Sophia about the pretty lady who brought food. Carmen's voice was tight with worry as she whispered about delusions and stress reactions, about how grief and poverty could make desperate minds see things that weren't there. "You need help, Maria, professional help before they take your children away." In the apartment complex courtyard, 2 camps had formed among the residents. Mrs. Chun and elderly Mr. Valdez spoke in hushed, reverent tones about answered prayers and divine intervention, while others like Janet Morrison from 3 rolled their eyes and talked about food pantry deliveries that Maria was too proud to admit receiving. Janet had called the authorities herself, convinced that Maria was either lying about her poverty for sympathy or suffering from some kind of breakdown that put the children at risk. Father Rodriguez found himself caught between his pastoral duty to investigate potential miracles and his practical concern for Maria's family. The diocesan office had already received calls from parishioners demanding an official response, some insisting on immediate veneration of the site, while others warned against endorsing obvious fraud. As he watched Maria answer the social workers' probing questions about her mental state and financial situation, he realized that seeking truth might cost this struggling mother everything she had left to lose. The eviction notice remained unchanged despite the miraculous food. Its red lettering as harsh as ever against the kitchen table, where Sophia now ate fresh fruit that shouldn't exist. Mrs. Patterson from the management office had listened to Maria's stammered explanation about divine provision with the cold patience of someone who had heard every excuse poverty could invent. "Miracles don't pay rent," she had said, tapping her pen against the overdue balance that grew larger with each passing day. Miguel's fever spiked during the night, his small body burning with infection that turned his miraculous pears into untouched offerings on his high chair tray. Maria held him against her chest in the emergency room waiting area, surrounded by other desperate mothers whose own children coughed and cried through the long hours before dawn. The abundance in her kitchen felt like a cruel joke when what her son needed was medicine and a doctor's attention, not supernatural bread that couldn't cure whatever was consuming his tiny frame. Carmen arrived at the hospital with dark circles under her eyes and words that cut deeper than any physical pain. "The whole family is talking about you, Maria. Mama called from Phoenix asking if you're having a nervous breakdown, and Aunt Rosa thinks you should come stay with her until you get your head straight. The children need stability, not a mother who sees visions when she should be looking for work and paying rent like every other struggling parent in the world." Dr. Phillips emerged from the examination room with Miguel limp in his arms, explaining pneumonia and hospital admission, while Maria's faith cracked under the weight of bills she couldn't pay and prayers that seemed to multiply her problems instead of solving them. The Virgin Mary had filled her cabinets, but left her son sick, her rent unpaid, and her family convinced she was losing her mind. Maria sat beside Miguel's hospital bed, watching his chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance, her pride finally cracking under the weight of medical bills that towered over her like mountains. The insurance forms require information she didn't have, signatures for coverage she couldn't afford, and co-payments that might as well have been requests for her firstborn child. Sophia pressed her small face against the window glass, asking why the pretty lady who brought food couldn't make Miguel better too. Father Rodriguez found her in the hospital chapel at 3 in the morning, her rosary worn smooth from desperate fingers and her faith stretched thin as paper. "I can't do this alone anymore," she whispered to the wooden crucifix that seemed as distant as the stars outside. "The miracle fed my children, but it didn't pay my rent, it didn't cure my son, and now everyone thinks I'm crazy while my family falls apart around me. Maybe Carmen is right. Maybe I'm losing my mind." The priest sat beside her in the silence that held both doubt and possibility, waiting until her tears slowed before speaking. "Sometimes God provides through other hands, Maria. Maybe the miracle wasn't just about the food. Maybe it was about opening your heart to receive help from people who want to give it. Mrs. Chun has been asking how she can help, and there are families in our parish who remember what it feels like to choose between medicine and meals." When Maria returned to her apartment that evening, she found Mrs. Chin waiting in the hallway with an envelope containing rent money collected from neighbors who had watched her struggle in solitude for too long. "We should have helped before the miracle," Mrs. Chun said gently. "Pride keeps us all hungry sometimes." The old woman's weathered hands held wisdom that Maria's desperation was finally ready to accept. The community gathering in Maria's small apartment had begun as a prayer circle for Miguel's recovery, with Mrs. Chun, Father Rodriguez, and 6 other neighbors crowded around the kitchen table where the first miracle had occurred. Maria had reluctantly agreed to let them come, her newfound humility warring with embarrassment at having so many people witness her need. Sophia sat quietly in the corner, her eyes fixed on the cabinet doors where she had first seen the beautiful lady appear. Father Rodriguez was midway through a prayer for healing when the familiar warmth began to fill the room, and every adult present felt their skin prickle with awareness that something beyond their understanding was unfolding. The light came softly this time, not the sudden brilliance that had startled Maria days before, but a gentle radiance that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Mrs. Chun gasped and pointed as the figure in blue robes materialized beside the refrigerator, her presence filling the cramped space with such peace that even the most skeptical neighbor found their doubts dissolving. "Your faith honors my son," the Virgin Mary spoke to the entire gathering, her voice reaching each heart with perfect clarity. She moved toward the hospital discharge papers that lay crumpled on the counter, touching them with hands that glowed like starlight. "Your child is healed," she said to Maria, and in that moment every person present knew with absolute certainty that Miguel's fever had broken, his breathing had cleared, and his small body was being restored to perfect health 3 miles away in his hospital bed. The apparition turned to address the entire group, her eyes holding each person in tender regard. "Feed my hungry children," she said, gesturing to the abundance that once again overflowed from cabinets and countertops, "and teach them that love multiplies when it is shared." The light faded slowly, leaving 8 adults forever changed by what they had witnessed together. The phone call from the hospital came at dawn, Dr. Phillips' voice filled with professional bewilderment as he explained that Miguel's pneumonia had vanished overnight without medical explanation. His lungs were clear, his fever completely gone, and his blood work showed no trace of the infection that had threatened his life just hours before. "We're discharging him this morning," the doctor said, "because frankly, Mrs. Santos, your son appears to be in perfect health, and we can't find anything wrong with him." Janet Morrison stood in Maria's doorway that afternoon, her usual skepticism replaced by something approaching awe as she watched Miguel run circles around the apartment with energy that defied his recent brush with death. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I called child services because I thought you were lying or delusional, but 8 people don't share the same hallucination, and sick children don't heal themselves overnight. Whatever happened in that kitchen, it was real, and I was wrong to doubt you." Father Rodriguez found his small parish office overwhelmed with parishioners seeking guidance about the miraculous events their questions ranging from theological implications to practical concerns about how to respond to obvious divine intervention. The diocesan office had dispatched investigators, but the priest already knew what they would find. He had felt the presence himself, had witnessed healing that transcended medical understanding, and had watched his community transform from suspicious isolation to unified purpose in the span of days. By evening, Maria's apartment had become an informal headquarters for something that was growing beyond her understanding. Neighbors arrived with bags of groceries to add to the supernatural abundance. Families shared stories of their own struggles with hunger and desperation, and Mrs. Chun had begun organizing a rotation schedule to ensure that every family in the complex would receive support when they needed it most. The story spread through the diocese like wildfire, carrying Maria's testimony to parishes across the city where hungry families recognized their own desperation in her words. Father Rodriguez found himself fielding calls from pastors whose congregations included single mothers choosing between electricity and groceries, elderly parishioners surviving on crackers and tea, and working families whose wages couldn't stretch to cover both rent and food. Each church wanted to know how they could establish their own ministry based on what had begun in apartment 2B. Maria stood before a congregation of 300 at St. Anthony's Cathedral, her voice trembling as she described the moment when supernatural provision had filled her empty cabinets while her children watched in wonder. The audience listened with the hungry attention of people who had prayed similar desperate prayers in their own kitchens. And when she finished speaking, the altar was covered with food donations and monetary gifts for families facing similar crises throughout the city. Rebecca Chun arrived from the Metro Herald with a photographer and the cynical worldview of someone who had covered too many false miracles and fraudulent faith healers. She interviewed Miguel's doctor, examined hospital records, and spoke with each of the 8 witnesses who had seen the second apparition together. Her planned expose of religious delusion gradually transformed into something approaching reverence as she documented healing that defied medical explanation and community transformation that couldn't be manufactured or faked. The ripple effects reached beyond the Catholic community when Pastor Williams from New Hope Baptist called Father Rodriguez to ask about partnering in feeding ministries that crossed denominational lines. Word of Maria's story had reached his congregation through Mrs. Chen's Baptist sister, and he recognized divine intervention that transcended human theological boundaries. The miracle had begun in one kitchen, but was growing into something that could feed an entire city. The abandoned storefront on Elm Street transformed into Miracle's Kitchen within 6 weeks, its empty shelves filling with donations that arrived daily from parishes, businesses, and families who had heard Maria's story. She stood in the center of what had once been a failed restaurant, watching volunteers sort fresh produce, while Sophia and Miguel played between the food tables, their laughter echoing through the space where supernatural provision was becoming sustainable community support. Maria had never imagined herself as a leader, but desperate mothers sought her guidance with the intuitive recognition that she understood their struggles from the inside out. She organized intake procedures with the gentle efficiency of someone who remembered the shame of empty cupboards, ensuring that families could receive help without the humiliation that often accompanied charity. Each Thursday evening, she held support meetings where single parents shared strategies for stretching budgets and maintaining hope when the world seemed stacked against them. The legal aid clinic that Father Rodriguez established in the back corner of Miracle's Kitchen addressed the practical realities that miracles alone couldn't solve. Volunteer attorneys helped families navigate eviction proceedings, apply for government assistance, and understand their rights when landlords or employers took advantage of their desperation. Maria watched with wonder as her personal crisis had grown into comprehensive support that addressed both spiritual and material needs of an entire community. Rebecca Chen's article in the Metro Herald had generated donations from readers who had never set foot in a church but recognized authentic compassion when they encountered it. The headline read "Miracle" or "Community," and her conclusion was that perhaps the distinction didn't matter when hungry children were being fed and struggling families were finding hope in a world that too often left them invisible and forgotten. Maria's kitchen had become sacred space. The small apartment where two miracles had occurred, now hosting weekly prayer gatherings that drew families from across the city. The cabinets where supernatural provision had first appeared were decorated with fresh flowers and handwritten prayer intentions from visitors who came seeking their own encounters with divine grace. Sophia took pride in showing newcomers exactly where the beautiful lady had stood, her 4-year-old certainty bringing comfort to adults whose faith wavered under the weight of their own desperate circumstances. The ministry had grown beyond anything Maria could have imagined when she knelt on her kitchen floor, crying for help. 3 satellite locations now operated throughout the metropolitan area, each one staffed by volunteers who had been touched by the original miracle and wanted to multiply its effects in their own communities. Miguel, now completely healthy and bursting with energy, helped sort donations at Miracle's Kitchen with the unconscious generosity of a child who had experienced both desperate need and abundant provision. Carmen arrived for Sunday dinner carrying grocery bags and an apology that had been years in the making. "I was wrong to doubt you," she said quietly as she watched Sophia lead a group of visiting children in prayer before their meal. "What happened here wasn't delusion or breakdown. It was grace, and I was too scared to believe that God might actually answer prayers the way we desperately need Him to." The family reconciliation felt like another miracle, healing relationships that had been fractured by misunderstanding and fear. The anniversary of the first apparition approached with Maria preparing to address a gathering of over 500 people who credited her story with inspiring their own ministries to hungry and struggling families. She stood in the kitchen where it all began, surrounded by abundance, both supernatural and natural, knowing that the miracle had never really been about food, but about teaching a community how to recognize and respond to the sacred hunger that existed in every human heart. The anniversary celebration filled the cathedral with faces that had become family over the past year, former strangers united by shared witness to miracles both supernatural and human. Maria stood at the altar where she had once trembled with uncertainty, now confident in her role as a vessel for grace that extended far beyond her own understanding. Sophia and Miguel sat in the front pew beside Carmen, their small hands folded in prayer, while Father Rodriguez offered thanksgiving for the transformation that had begun with empty cabinets and desperate prayer. The Miracles Kitchen Network had fed over 3,000 families in 12 months. But Maria knew the real miracle was how hunger had taught them to recognize each other's need and respond with open hearts. She looked out at the congregation and saw Mrs. Chun coordinating volunteers, Janet Morrison leading a support group for single mothers, and Rebecca Chun documenting the anniversary for a follow-up story about sustained community change that defied cynical expectations about human nature. As the service concluded, Maria returned to her apartment where the original miracle had occurred, finding the kitchen filled once again with abundance that arrived through natural generosity rather than supernatural intervention. The cabinets held donations from families who remembered their own desperate moments, and the refrigerator contained fresh groceries purchased with money earned through jobs that community connections had helped people secure. The miracle had evolved from divine provision to human compassion, but the grace remained the same. Standing in the space where everything had changed, Maria offered a prayer of gratitude for empty cupboards that had opened her heart to receive help and for abundant provision that had taught her how to give. "If this story has touched your heart," she whispered to the families who might be listening, "share how grace has appeared in your own kitchen, your own desperate moments, or your own community. Tell us about the miracles that happen when people choose to feed each other's hunger, both physical and spiritual."